He wasn't supposed to sit at the table reserved for billionaires. But when the single-dad mechanic refused to move, what he said next silenced the entire room, especially the woman who thought she owned it. Before we dive in, take a second and let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story is one you'll never forget. It might just blow your mind. The chandeliers of the Harrington Hotel dripped golden light over crystal glasses and velvet gowns, each detail choreographed to remind its guests they were standing inside power. Every year, the charity gala was less about the cause than about the hierarchy, and at the center of it all stood the table. 12 feet of oak, polished so smooth, it reflected candle flames like liquid. The chairs, high-backed and velvet-lined, stood like a ring of thrones. On its edge, a small brass plaque caught the glow. Reserved for the Harrington Foundation Board. No one questioned it. No one dared. The table didn't just belong to the board, it belonged to Evelyn Harrington herself, the woman who had rebuilt her father's fractured empire into something ironclad. The table was her stage, her fortress, her proof that she belonged in rooms where kings and senators leaned forward to hear her speak. Tonight was no different. Strains of violins braided through the air as servers glided between tables, balancing trays of champagne. The city's most powerful figures filled the room, their laughter polished, their gestures deliberate. Beneath it all was an unspoken command: don't touch the table. Every waiter whispered it to the new staff. Every guest knew it without being told. The oak wasn't furniture, it was ceremony. It was the line that separated those who mattered from those who served. That's why the moment he walked in, the room bent around him. Daniel Cross did not belong here. His shirt still carried faint smears of grease, his boots worn from years of oil-slick concrete. His shoulders were square but heavy, the posture of a man used to lifting more than his share of weight. His daughter Grace trailed behind him, clutching a sketchbook to her chest as though it were armor. She was 12, her braid loose, her sneakers scuffed, too ordinary a presence in a room stitched together with silk and silver. They should have hovered by the catering doors, invisible like the other workers summoned here for grunt tasks. Daniel could have leaned against a wall, endured the sideways glances, counted the hours until he could leave. That's what was expected of men like him. Stay quiet, stay useful, stay unseen. But Daniel's eyes found the oak table immediately, and something shifted. He guided Grace toward a quiet corner, brushing her shoulder with a reassuring hand, and then he crossed the marble floor alone. Conversations faltered. Forks froze mid-air. He pulled out one of the velvet-backed chairs with a sound that scraped like a challenge against the marble hush. The room inhaled sharply. A mechanic's hands, scarred and calloused, rested on a table once graced by presidents. Gasps rippled in waves, followed by sharp whispers. Who is he? Where's security? What does he think he's doing? Evelyn Harrington, seated at the head of the table in a pearl-white gown, turned her head slowly. Her eyes, sharp enough to silence boardrooms, locked on him. Daniel didn't flinch. He lowered himself into the chair with deliberate calm, his grease-stained sleeves brushing against fabric worth more than his month's rent. He sat as though the oak belonged under his elbows, as though the chandeliers had been lit, to reflect in his eyes. And then, in a voice steady enough to cut through the string quartet, he spoke. "This table is mine now." The words dropped into the room like stone into still water. Shock spread across the hall. Donors glanced toward Evelyn, waiting for her ice-cold rebuke, waiting for security to drag the intruder away. Waiters froze with trays trembling in their hands. Grace, from her corner, stopped sketching mid-line, her pencil suspended. Evelyn blinked once, her face unreadable. In her world, people didn't claim what was hers. Not seats, not tables, not history. Yet here sat a man who looked like he had just stepped out of a garage, claiming her sanctuary without hesitation. For a moment, the violins faltered, the chandeliers seemed too bright, and the entire room leaned toward the man who had spoken the unthinkable. And Daniel Cross, widowed mechanic, father of a girl who believed in him more than the world ever would, sat with the stillness of a man who knew he belonged. The words did not echo. They settled, heavy, like iron dropped onto marble. A man in a grease-stained shirt had dared to speak of lineage in a hall full of pedigrees. Conversations died in the middle of carefully rehearsed laughs. Waiters froze, silver trays suspended mid-air. Champagne bubbles clung to crystal rims, unwilling to break. The orchestra faltered, bows hovering over strings, as though even the music needed to hear what had just been said. Evelyn Harrington turned her head with the poise of a queen who had executed wars by silence alone. Her pearl-white gown shimmered in the golden light, every diamond at her neck catching fire. She didn't blink as her eyes found the intruder seated at her table. Eyes honed by years of negotiations where entire companies dissolved at her raised brow. The room leaned toward her, waiting for the ice to shatter. "Excuse me?" she said. Not loud, but clear enough to slice through the suspended hush. It wasn't a question, it was a warning, wrapped in a word. Daniel Cross did not bow beneath it. He adjusted his sleeve as though preparing for work, not judgment. His voice, low but firm, carried across the oak with the weight of memory. "My father built this table," he said, with his hands. "Every joint, every grain of wood, he carved it in his workshop before you people ever sat here pretending it belonged to you." The gasp was collective, a sound of pearls clutched and masks cracking. A senator's wife muttered something about insolence. A venture capitalist whispered, "Security," to no one in particular, yet no one moved. They were watching Evelyn, always Evelyn. Her fingers tightened on her glass, not trembling, just enough to keep it from betraying her. She had not expected this. She had expected sycophants, donors, applause. She had expected her table to gleam beneath chandeliers as a symbol of her control. Instead, it had become a mirror held up to her past. Evelyn Harrington was not a woman easily rattled. She had survived whispers of scandal, the deaths of parents, the knives of boardroom betrayal. But here was a stranger with oil on his sleeves and grief in his jawline, unmasking her empire with nothing more than truth. Eyes darted between them. Who was this man? A mechanic? A ghost from the hotel's history? How could he claim something so untouchable and speak of it with reverence? Daniel sat steady, the chair beneath him no longer velvet but memory. He didn't need to raise his voice. The oak spoke for him. His father's hands lingered in every carved curve, every hidden groove beneath its polish. He belonged not because of money, but because blood and sweat had varnished the wood long before Evelyn's empire touched it. The silence swelled. It was no longer awkward. It was crushing, a pressure that filled the lungs of everyone present. The orchestra lowered their instruments fully now, unsure if they were meant to play through history unfolding before them. A waiter's tray quivered, glasses clinking faintly like nervous applause. Evelyn did not look away. Her mask of authority held, but beneath it, something cracked. She had not expected history to arrive in work boots. She had not expected calloused hands to remind her that her father's empire had always rested on backs she had never thanked. She had not expected grief and honesty to sit at her table, daring her to acknowledge it. She wanted to dismiss him with a flick of her wrist, to summon guards and restore order with her practiced smile. But her throat refused to form the command. Somewhere deep she felt it. The oak had shifted beneath her. The silence stretched further, heavier, until it was no longer absence of sound but a force of its own, a weight pressing on every chest in the room. A silence so alive it drowned the chandelier's hum and pinned every guest to their seats. And at the center of it, Daniel Cross sat unmoving, a mechanic in a borrowed moment of defiance, making the most powerful woman in the city remember what she had chosen to forget. Daniel Cross had never belonged to crystal halls or velvet chairs. His world had been smaller, grittier, and in many ways more honest. He was born in the back of a garage where the air carried the scent of gasoline, metal filings, and the faint sweetness of sawdust. His father, Thomas Cross, moved easily between tools, one moment tuning an engine with grease on his knuckles, the next running his calloused hands across a slab of oak with the patience of an artist. For Thomas, fixing cars was survival, but shaping wood was legacy. He used to tell Daniel, "Everything worth building has a heartbeat, if you know how to listen." Engines thumped, wood hummed, even the silence of a freshly sanded plank carried memory. As a boy, Daniel leaned close to both. He learned that a misfiring cylinder had a rhythm, like a cough in the chest. He learned that grain patterns in oak could steer the curve of a table leg. His father never rushed. He insisted that respect for materials was respect for the people who would one day gather around them. "A machine will forgive mistakes," Thomas said once, wiping his brow. "Wood won't." "It remembers everything you do to it," Daniel carried that line like scripture. But life doesn't bow to poetry for long. In his 20s, Daniel tried to carve a different path. He had sketches of buildings folded in notebooks, ideas for bridges and homes where beauty and strength could coexist. Architecture whispered of a future with clean lines and possibility. He married Emily, a schoolteacher with laughter that filled every quiet corner. And together they dreamed of a life where ambition meant more than survival. For a while, it almost seemed within reach. Then the accident came like a thief in daylight. One phone call, one mangled wreck, and Emily was gone. Just like that, the world narrowed. His sketches went untouched, his notebooks closed. All that remained was the sound of his daughter Grace crying into his chest and the weight of Bill stacking like bricks on his back. Architecture didn't pay quickly enough. Dreams couldn't buy food or keep the lights on. So Daniel returned to what he knew, the garage. Engines and oil stains. 12-hour shifts, calloused hands, the smell of gasoline that refused to wash out no matter how hard he scrubbed. Grace became his compass. Every choice filtered through her small face, her need for stability, her right to a father who didn't collapse under grief. He cooked simple meals, packed her lunches, fixed her sneakers with glue when money was thin. He smiled when he was breaking because she deserved to believe the world still held light. Survival replaced ambition. Steady replaced inspired. But in the quiet hours when Grace was asleep and the house finally stilled, Daniel sometimes opened the garage's side door and traced the past. Against the wall, under a dusty tarp, sat the table he and his father had built together. 12 feet of oak, heavy enough to demand 2 men's backs just to lift it. They had sanded it for weeks, polished it until it gleamed, carved the underside with a mark, a cross within a circle. Thomas's way of saying we were here. Years later, debts forced its sale, and the Harrington Hotel paid handsomely for what they called an artisan masterpiece. Daniel let it go, but part of him never did. Every once in a while, late at night, he'd press his palm against the bare floor where it once stood and feel the ghost of its weight. So when he walked into the Harrington gala and saw it again under chandeliers, surrounded by gowns and tuxedos, something in him refused to bend. He saw Evelyn Harrington parading her donors around it like it was hers, like history could be bought and displayed with a brass plaque. But oak remembers, grain remembers. His father's hands were still in that table, his own too, carved deep into the heart of it. He felt Emily's voice in the back of his mind, soft but insistent. Don't let Grace forget where she comes from. And so he didn't. He walked across the marble floor, pulled out the velvet-backed chair, and sat. The whispers, the gasps, the outrage of wealth, it all blurred into noise. Daniel's hand brushed the surface of the table. This table remembers me, he thought, steady and unafraid. And tonight, no matter how gilded the room or how powerful the woman at its head, so would they. Evelyn Harrington had been raised in a world where hesitation was weakness. Her father had trained her like a soldier long before she inherited his empire, teaching her to wield silence the way others wielded blades. By 12, she was sitting in on board meetings, learning to read a man's ambition by the twitch of his jaw, the way his eyes darted when the numbers turned against him. Words, her father told her, were cheap. Silence, on the other hand, was priceless. She had learned to let others stumble into the void she created, to let their nervous chatter reveal everything they tried so hard to conceal. By the time she turned 25, she could end a negotiation without ever raising her voice. By 30, she had become the youngest CEO in her family's history. Now, at 39, she was more myth than woman. In most rooms she entered, people feared the stillness she carried with her, the pause before she spoke, as though she could decide their fate by choosing not to answer. Tonight was supposed to be no different. The Harrington Foundation gala had been orchestrated down to the second. The donors were strategically seated, the cameras positioned to catch her best angle when she stood to make her speech about expanding hospital access. Every glass of champagne, every arrangement of white roses on the tables, every measure of the orchestra had been rehearsed like a symphony designed to remind the city that Evelyn Harrington not only ruled, but gave generously. It was her ritual: dazzle, inspire, control. Then Daniel Cross sat at her table. At first she thought it was a joke, some clumsy staff member too green to know the unspoken rule, but when the gasps spread and the whispers hissed across the hall, she realized it was something else. The man wasn't fumbling, wasn't apologizing. He sat with an ease that didn't belong, his shoulders squared, his expression calm. He didn't shrink under the chandeliers or the weight of dozens of eyes slicing into him. He didn't even look at her. He looked at the oak, her oak. That table was more than furniture. It was a stage, a symbol of her untouchable authority. She had hosted senators at it, closed deals worth billions across it. She had let it become an extension of herself, an altar on which others laid their admiration. And now this man, with grease still staining the cuffs of his shirt, had placed his hand upon it as though it were his right. Her script fractured. She was supposed to rise, to smile, to cue the first violin, and charm the room with carefully chosen words. But for the first time in years, Evelyn Harrington had nothing rehearsed to say. She studied him. His voice, when he spoke of his father building the table, carried no tremor. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't a performance. It was truth. And truth had a way of making her silence feel smaller, less controlled. She curled her fingers tighter around her glass, anchoring herself, keeping her face composed even as the ground beneath her shifted. This was her weapon, silence, the pause that unsettled everyone else. But tonight she wasn't the one commanding it. Tonight the silence belonged to him, stretching across the hall until even the orchestra dared not breathe. Evelyn had inherited billions, but not softness. She had mastered strategy, power, and control, but she had never prepared for this, a man who looked past her armor and her fortune, and saw not her, not even the room, but the table that had carried her image for so long. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her like a hand she couldn't move, and for the first time since she was 12 years old, Evelyn Harrington was caught in a silence she did not own. Grace sat on the edge of the room, half hidden by the sweep of a velvet curtain, her sketchbook balanced across her knees. The hall glittered with chandeliers and sequined gowns, but she barely noticed. Her sneakers, scuffed at the toes and patched with tape on one side, tapped lightly against the polished floor. Around her, whispers hissed like steam escaping from cracks, adults twisting in their seats to gawk at her father as though he'd committed a crime simply by sitting down. But Grace's pencil didn't move. It hovered, paused in mid-line, because she wasn't sketching the table or the gowns or the diamond bracelets. She was sketching him. At 12 years old, she had learned to pay attention to details most people ignored. She knew the way her dad's hands tightened on the steering wheel when bills piled up on the counter. She knew how he left the TV on after she fell asleep, not because he wanted to watch, but because silence had grown too loud since her mother died. She knew he still wore his wedding ring, the band dull now, but never once removed. She knew he carried ghosts, even if he smiled so she wouldn't have to carry them too, and she knew this look, the one he wore now, seated at a table he wasn't supposed to touch. His back was straight, his chin lifted just enough, a stillness in him like the eye of a storm. It wasn't defiance in the way the crowd believed, it was memory. Her pencil finally touched the page, capturing the slope of his shoulders, the steady line of his jaw. She didn't draw the grease on his shirt or the exhaustion in his eyes. She drew him taller, broader, filling the space the way he always seemed to fill their small apartment at night when the world felt too big for her to face alone. The page became a stage. She drew him as a giant at the table, while around him tiny figures hunched in their velvet-backed chairs, anxious, shrinking, fearful of a man who had nothing but truth to offer. Her father did not look like them, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that he didn't look away. Grace smiled softly as the pencil curved. She added shadows where the chandeliers should have been, but instead of casting him in darkness, the light seemed to radiate from his chest outward. On paper, she gave him the power she had always felt in the quiet moments, the way his voice steadied her when nightmares chased her awake, the way his rough hands had learned to braid her hair after too many clumsy mornings, the way he always bent low to listen, as though her words carried weight no one else could hear. Around her, adults bristled. She caught snippets of their words, sharp and ugly. Janitor, audacity, doesn't belong. But to Grace they sounded small, their voices brittle as glass. She tilted her head, studying her drawing, and thought how funny it was that these people draped in silk and jewels looked so fragile next to a man in work boots. They were afraid of someone who wasn't afraid of them. She shaded the edge of the table, her strokes firm. She wanted the wood to look heavy because she understood weight, what her father carried, what he tried to protect her from. But she also wanted to show that he could bear it, that no matter how hard the world pressed down, he didn't fold. He had taught her something most of these glittering people had forgotten, that dignity didn't come from money or seats reserved with brass plaques. It came from showing up, from standing tall even when life tried to bend you small. Grace's pencil slowed. She added the last detail, her father's hand resting on the table, not clenched, not grasping, just steady. A hand that fixed engines, cooked eggs in the morning, tied shoelaces, built futures out of scraps. A hand that belonged there because it had once built the table itself. She leaned back, studying the image, her chest swelling with something fierce and warm. In her drawing, there was no question of who belonged. The giant was her dad, and the tiny, anxious figures were everyone else. Grace pressed her lips together to keep the smile from spilling too wide. Whatever the hall believed, whatever whispers filled the night, her page told the truth. She closed the sketchbook gently, hugging it to her chest like a secret, and looked up at him again. He hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, even as Evelyn Harrington's eyes bore into him from across the oak. Grace felt her throat tighten with pride. Let them whisper. Let them bristle. She already knew the ending. In her world, in her drawing, her dad had always been the one who truly belonged. Security! The word cracked through the air like a whip, sharp and immediate, born of outrage rather than necessity. A donor in a tuxedo, cheeks flushed with indignation, leaned forward and hissed it again. Two men in black suits, thick-shouldered and unsmiling, began their march across the hall, their polished shoes tapping like drums against marble. The crowd stirred, hungry for spectacle, relieved that order was about to be restored. But before they reached the oak, Evelyn Harrington lifted her hand. A small gesture, a queen's command. The guards froze mid-step, their bulk hovering at the edge of tension. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room obeyed her silence, waiting. Her pearl-white gown shimmered in the light, and she sat like a sculpture carved from control. Her eyes narrowed as she studied Daniel, who sat steady in the velvet-backed chair as if he had been born there. "You said your father built this table?" she asked. Her tone was not disbelief. It was curiosity laced with warning. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "He did." A ripple of scoffs and whispers passed down the row of donors. One woman snorted into her wineglass, while another leaned across to mutter something about imposters. But Daniel didn't look at them. He didn't even look at Evelyn's diamonds, or the power that clung to her like a second skin. He lowered his hand to the edge of the oak and brushed his fingertips across the polished grain, as though greeting an old friend. "Then prove it," Evelyn said. Her voice had a dangerous kind of calm, the calm of a hunter circling prey. "Tell us something no one else knows." The orchestra had stopped playing. Waiters with trays stood stranded between tables, afraid to move, afraid to shatter the charged air. Dozens of eyes bore down on Daniel, some mocking, others restless, all waiting for him to stumble. He leaned forward slightly, his hand resting flat on the wood. His thumb moved back and forth across the edge, like memory guiding him home. "Underside, left corner," he said quietly. He carved a mark there, a cross inside a circle, his signature, his way of saying, "We were here." The words hung for a beat, dismissed by many before they could even land. But Evelyn arched one sculpted brow, amusement flickering across her otherwise impassive face. She gestured with two fingers to the guard at her right. The man crouched, ducked beneath the heavy oak, his black suit brushing the carpet. Silence thickened, breathless and waiting. When he emerged again, his expression had shifted. He straightened and gave a sharp nod. The mark was there. Gasps broke across the hall like a storm rolling through glass. A senator's fork clattered to his plate. Someone muttered, "Impossible," while another whispered, "So it's true?" Heads craned, eyes darted between Evelyn and the man who sat at her table, calm as stone. Evelyn's gaze sharpened, her poise cracking just enough for something unfamiliar to slip through. She had expected to expose a liar, to embarrass him into retreat. Instead, the ground beneath her had shifted. He was not an intruder clumsily seeking attention. He was tethered to the very foundation of her empire, roots winding deeper than her wealth could ever purchase. The air in the hall shifted with her silence. What moments ago had been outrage was now unease. Daniel had claimed more than a chair. He had claimed history, and the table had sided with him. Evelyn held his gaze, her mask of control unbroken, but inside she wasn't certain whether she was being challenged or reminded. And in that moment, for the first time all evening, it was not the billionaire heiress who owned the silence. It was the mechanic. The waiters stood in a crooked line at the edge of the room, trays balanced in shaking hands, eyes darting between one another as though waiting for permission from the air itself. The scent of roasted lamb and buttered asparagus hung heavy, but no one lifted a fork. Donors leaned across their plates, hissing whispers sharp enough to cut through the hush. "Remove him, throw him out, this is obscene." Others leaned back, half smirking, their curiosity outweighing their outrage. The room was a theater, and Daniel Cross, grease still faintly staining his shirt cuffs, had become the unexpected lead. Evelyn tapped her glass just once. The sound rang pure and commanding. The orchestra froze mid-phrase, strings humming into silence. All eyes turned to her. She hadn't rehearsed this moment, hadn't imagined it in any of the careful planning she devoted to the night, yet the word slipped out before she could stop it. "Then sit." It surprised her almost as much as the crowd. The hall seemed to tilt, donors blinking as though they had misheard. Daniel raised a brow, the faintest trace of a wry smile flickering before it was gone. He lowered himself back into the chair with deliberate calm, his movements unhurried, unbothered. The velvet embraced him as though it had been waiting. A mechanic, a widower, a man with no fortune, now sat in the place where senators once debated policy and princes once toasted legacy. Grace, tucked into her corner with her sketchbook, froze for a breath before her pencil raced again. Her eyes wide, she captured her father in frantic strokes, his shoulders squared, his face calm, the oak table gleaming beneath his hand. Faster and faster she drew, as if afraid the moment would vanish before her page could hold it. Around them, donors shifted uneasily. One cleared his throat in protest, but found Evelyn's eyes already on him, sharp enough to silence. Another reached for his glass, only to find his hand trembling too much to lift it. No one spoke above a whisper, and every whisper became another thread in the tapestry of tension stretching across the room. Daniel picked up his fork. He did it slowly, deliberately, as though the silverware might test him. He cut into the lamb without flourish, lifted the bite to his mouth, and chewed with a composure that was almost defiant. He did not glance at the chandeliers or the guests who stared as if a wolf had taken a seat at their feast. He ate, simply, steadily. Evelyn studied him. She expected a twitch, a nervous glance, the telltale signs of a man out of place. But there was none. He didn't fidget, he didn't shrink. His movements were steady, unhurried, each gesture measured with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived worse silences than this. She had seen men tremble under her gaze, men with fortunes larger than countries who wilted when her voice fell still. But this man who had nothing sat across from her as though the weight of her empire couldn't touch him. The clock ticked on the far wall, its steady rhythm louder than cutlery, louder than breathing. Each second amplified the absurdity and the inevitability of what was happening. This wasn't just an interruption anymore, it was a shift. The gala Evelyn had designed, down to the last flower arrangement, had been rewritten by a man who refused to disappear. And stranger still, she didn't feel diminished. She felt something she hadn't allowed herself in years. Curious. Who was he really? Not just a mechanic who claimed lineage through wood and memory. There was something else, something in the way his silence wasn't submission but presence, a refusal to surrender the space he had taken. She hated it and admired it in the same breath. Grace's pencil scratched furiously, her eyes flicking between her father and the page. Evelyn caught the girl's expression, pride, unshaken, as though this entire hall of jewels and silk meant nothing compared to the man sitting at her table. Evelyn's gaze lingered a moment longer on the child before returning to the father. The orchestra waited, bows hovering, glances darting to Evelyn for their cue to resume. But she left them in silence. For the first time all night, Evelyn Harrington's carefully orchestrated gala no longer belonged to her. It belonged to him. And she found herself wondering not how to take it back, but what might happen if she let it stay that way. The cutlery clinked without rhythm, the kind of forced noise that happens when people are pretending to eat, but are really just waiting for someone else to break the tension. Plates shifted, glasses tilted, but no one was tasting the food. The table had become the stage, and every guest was watching the uninvited actor who sat with his sleeves still faintly dark from grease, using the silverware like it had always belonged in his hands. Evelyn's voice cut through the uneasy quiet, even and precise. "What do you fix, Mr. Cross?" Daniel dabbed his mouth with the napkin, unhurried. His eyes lifted to hers without a flicker of apology. "Engines. Broken ones. Cars most people give up on." The words sat heavy, simple, and unpolished, but they carried the weight of a man who knew more about salvaging ruin than any donor at the table ever would. A banker smirked into his glass. A woman in diamonds rolled her eyes, but Daniel wasn't speaking to them. He wasn't speaking for them either. His gaze shifted, almost imperceptibly, to the oak between them. "And furniture?" Evelyn asked, tilting her head, tone sharpened with curiosity. His hand moved, fingertips grazing the polished edge with a tenderness that didn't fit the size of them. "Only once, he said softly. "This." It was almost reverent, the way he said it, like naming a place of worship. For a moment Evelyn thought she could hear the wood breathe, as though the table itself remembered the weight of the hands that had built it. Her chest tightened. She masked it with a sip of wine. "Engines and oak," she said, her lips curving faintly. "Quite the resume." Daniel leaned back slightly, his voice still calm, steady, not trying to impress, not trying to defend. "Engines teach patience. Oak teaches memory." They're not so different. Both hold the story of everyone who's touched them. The words slipped past the silk and jewels at the table like oil seeping into stone, low, quiet, yet impossible to ignore. Evelyn felt the air shift in her lungs. Reverence. That's what it was. She hadn't heard that tone in years. Not in boardrooms, not at galas, not in conversations where worth was measured in zeros and signatures. Reverence, not for wealth or power, but for craft, for survival, for life itself. A man 2 chairs down chuckled dismissively. "Poetic," he muttered under his breath. Another donor, trying to break the tension, said louder, "And here I thought we were here for dinner, not sermons on carpentry." Laughter flickered down the table, brittle, defensive. Daniel didn't flinch. His eyes never left Evelyn's. She leaned in, unable to stop herself. "And what story," she asked, "does this table hold now?" He didn't answer immediately. He let the silence settle first, as if testing the grain of it, listening to the hum beneath the surface. Then, steady as stone, he said, "One of ownership, confused with belonging." It hit harder than champagne, sharper than any insult, because it was truth laid bare. Evelyn felt it land in her chest, a crack spreading where her certainty had lived. Ownership was her currency, documents, deeds, contracts. Belonging was messier, unpurchasable. And here was this man, a mechanic, daring to suggest she had mistaken one for the other. The laughter faltered. No one knew where to look. Evelyn sat back, her fingers curling lightly around her glass, though she did not drink. She studied him, really studied him, and for the first time in years, she felt herself being studied back. Not as an heiress, not as a figure of power, but as a person. The oak gleamed between them. A bridge, a reminder, a witness. Daniel didn't press further. He didn't need to. The table had spoken, and everyone knew it. Evelyn Harrington had built her empire on silence, but tonight the silence wasn't hers. Tonight it belonged to him. Daniel's eyes stayed steady on Evelyn, but inside her question had opened a door he could never keep fully shut. The words about ownership and belonging still lingered in the air when his mind slipped away, back to a night that had branded him forever. The night Emily left. The hospital room had been dim, the kind of dim where shadows seem kinder than the light. Machines hummed their indifferent song, the steady rise and fall of numbers that didn't matter anymore. Emily's hand was small in his, the strength gone from her grip but not from her voice. She had whispered something he had carried every day since. Don't let Grace forget where she comes from. Don't let her believe survival means silence. Those words dug into him like nails. He'd nodded, but it hadn't been enough. How could it ever be enough? Her breath was shallow, her smile faint but stubborn. The same smile that had teased him years before when he was too shy to ask her to dance in a roadside diner. Now she was fading, and the only thing she asked of him was to keep their daughter's roots alive, to teach her that being quiet wasn't the same as being safe. When Emily slipped away, the silence in that room was different from any other Daniel had ever known. It wasn't stillness, it was a weight pressing down on his chest, a suffocation he carried out of the hospital and into every day that followed. The promise wasn't just her last words, it became his chain, his anchor, and his reason to keep breathing when everything else told him to collapse. So he worked. He worked until his hands ached and his back stiffened. He fixed engines that had been written off, cars that people swore belonged in junkyards. He took every shift, every side job, because food had to be bought and rent had to be paid. He refused to let Grace be swallowed into the illusion of wealth she didn't belong to. He kept her in public schools, made her pack her own lunches, walked her through the world with the knowledge that nothing was free and nothing was guaranteed. People told him to ask the Harrington Foundation for scholarships, for assistance. That's what they're there for, neighbors said. But Daniel heard Emily's voice. She hadn't told him to beg. She'd told him to remember, and so he did. Every day he held on, not to charity, but to memory, to the wood grain of a table his father had built with him in their garage, sanded until their hands were raw. That table had been sold years ago to pay off debts. He had let it go, but not fully. He never could. Because it wasn't just oak, it was history. It was craft. It was proof that the cross name meant something carved, not bought. When he learned of the gala, when he saw the Harrington name printed in gold on flyers, parading their foundation as the saviors of the poor, he felt the pull. Not for money, not for recognition. He didn't care for their handshakes or their speeches about generosity. What he cared about was that table. His father's hand still lived in its bones. His own fingerprints were somewhere deep beneath the polish. And now it was being used as a throne, as a stage, as a prop for wealth that had never known what it cost to build something from nothing. Emily's voice came back to him that night stronger than it had in years. Don't let Grace forget where she comes from. Don't let her believe survival means silence. He couldn't let his daughter sit quietly in the corner of that hall and think they were lesser, that they had no claim, that the rich owned not only the future but also the past. This wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. He hadn't sat at that table to embarrass anyone or to be noticed. He had done it because belonging doesn't ask permission. He had done it because Emily's promise wasn't finished. Because his daughter needed to see that survival wasn't silence. It was speaking without fear. No billionaire's glare, no polished smile, no icy voice would shame him back into the shadows. The table remembered him, and tonight, so would they. Evelyn Harrington had been called many things over the years: ruthless, brilliant, unshakable. She had sat across from senators who lied with polished smiles, brokers who disguised fear with arrogance, rivals who sharpened every word like knives. She had stared them all down and left unscathed. Scandal had brushed her name like ash and slid off her gowns without leaving a mark. Betrayals in boardrooms had come and gone, but she remained standing, diamonds intact, her empire intact. She had learned long ago that power wasn't about being loved, it was about being unbreakable. But the mechanic's calm was something else entirely. He didn't fight her with bluster or wit. He didn't tremble beneath her silence, the weapon she had wielded all her life. He simply sat there, steady, as though the world couldn't shame him into shrinking. His words weren't clever, but they cut with the weight of something rarer than strategy: truth. She had spent her life pretending her father had built the Harrington Empire through brilliance alone, through his cunning and his will. That was the story she carried, the one the press adored. But sitting across from Daniel, she felt the truth press against her like a mirror she didn't want to look into. Her father hadn't built anything alone. It was the craftsmen, the workers, the unseen hands, men like Daniel's father, who had carved the wood, forged the steel, laid the bricks, and soldered the wires that made Harrington Towers stand and Harrington hotels gleam. Her father had polished the surface and taken the bow. She had followed his script without ever asking what lay beneath the gloss. Now, the grain of the oak beneath her fingertips seemed to hum differently, no longer just a surface to display wealth, but a reminder of hands she had never thanked. And across from her, the man who carried that legacy was looking at her with eyes that didn't see a billionaire or a queen of the gala. They saw a woman at a table that wasn't entirely hers. For the first time in years, Evelyn felt her mask slip. Just for a heartbeat. It was as though her carefully cultivated armor, the one polished by stylists and fortified by contracts, cracked down the middle, and in that small crack she felt something she despised: vulnerability. She caught herself quickly, drawing her spine straighter, smoothing her expression until it was once again the mask the world knew. She could not let the room see her falter, not the donors, not the press, not the waiters lingering nervously with trays. only him. She fixed her gaze on him, sharp enough to slice, and asked, "Why here? Why tonight?" Daniel didn't hesitate. His eyes held hers without flinching. "Because silence is comfortable until it isn't," he said, "and because my daughter deserves to see what standing looks like." The words landed with a weight she hadn't expected. His daughter. Evelyn's chest tightened in a way she hadn't felt in years. She had no children, no family left. Her wealth filled houses, but never rooms. Her power filled articles, but not arms. She had traded companionship for command, traded softness for survival. And this man, this mechanic, sat across from her, reminding her, without cruelty, without accusation, of what she had given up. She wanted to dismiss it, to laugh, to remind him that daughters needed security, not symbolism. But the truth burned too clearly. She thought of the empty halls of her penthouse, of the dinners eaten alone with only the hum of the city outside to answer her. She thought of how many times she had looked into mirrors and found no one behind her reflection. And now here was this man, claiming nothing but dignity, sitting with his daughter, watching from the corner, and he seemed to have more than she ever had. The chandeliers glittered above her like stars she couldn't reach. Her grip on her glass tightened until her knuckles paled. She forced her breath to remain even, her smile faint and practiced. The room couldn't see the fracture, only she could feel it. Evelyn Harrington, untouchable billionaire, had built an empire of steel and silence. But tonight, across from Daniel Cross, she realized the silence was no longer hers. And worse, it had begun to ask her questions she couldn't answer. Grace had been still through all of it, folded into her corner, like she always did when the world felt too loud. Her knees bent up, sketchbook pressed against them, pencil scratching in quick bursts, and then pausing, waiting, listening. The whispers of the donors slid past her ears like static. The sharp clinks of crystal glasses didn't distract her. Even her father's steady voice, carrying truths heavy enough to split the room, didn't make her look up. She had learned early that silence was sometimes the best kind of shield. But she also knew that silence had a weight, and if you carried it too long, it became a lie. So when she saw the way her father sat, calm and upright in a chair he was never supposed to touch, and when she saw Evelyn Harrington's mask flicker just enough to show the outline of doubt beneath, Grace felt the lie pressing down. She felt the promise of her mother's words humming in her chest, words she had heard whispered more times than she could count. "Don't let survival turn you into a ghost." Grace had never understood all of it, not fully, but she knew enough to recognize the moment her voice mattered. Her pencil stilled. Her hands shook not because she was afraid of them, the glittering people in gowns and suits, but because she was afraid of not speaking at all. Slowly, she stood. The room hadn't noticed her at first, small and ordinary in sneakers too worn to squeak against the polished floor. But when her sketchbook clutched in her trembling hands lifted, the movement cut through the air like a bell. "He's not lying," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried. It floated over the hush, over the chandeliers, over the clattering heartbeat of the crowd. Heads turned, frowns deepened, murmurs rippled. But she didn't waver. She turned the sketchbook around. On the page, the oak table stretched across the paper, solid and certain. Her father sat beside it, drawn larger than life, his shoulders squared, his face steady. Across from him was Evelyn, not draped in jewels, not wrapped in armor, but smaller, softer, reaching across the grain. There was no audience in the drawing, no glittering gowns or smirking men, just the three of them, her father, the table, and Evelyn. "My mom said tables are where families sit," Grace whispered. Her voice trembled on the first word but found strength as she went on. "If you keep people away, it's not a table anymore. It's just wood." The hall hushed deeper than before. Even the orchestra, instruments lowered to their laps, seemed caught in her words. Donors shifted uncomfortably, some scoffing under their breath, others leaning forward to spite themselves. Evelyn's throat tightened. Her instinct was to dismiss it, to smile politely, to pat the child's head with the condescension of someone who had no time for sentiment. But then she looked into Grace's wide, unflinching eyes. They were eyes that carried both loss and certainty, eyes that had seen more than any child should and yet refused to look away. It wasn't childish. It wasn't naive. It was clarity so sharp it stripped the room bare. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn felt her carefully rehearsed armor tremble. Her hand tightened on the stem of her glass, but she didn't raise it. She couldn't. The truth was standing in front of her with messy hair and trembling hands, holding up a piece of paper like scripture. Daniel didn't move. His chest swelled, pride and ache knotted together, but he stayed still. He knew this was her moment, not his. Grace had spoken into a room built on silence, and the silence had listened. The chandeliers glittered overhead, the perfume of orchids hung heavy, and the city's most powerful people sat frozen, not by a billionaire's command, but by the voice of a 12-year-old girl who had reminded them what a table was meant to be. The eruption was instant, a storm breaking over the oak. Chairs scraped, voices rose, and the fragile hush Grace's words had conjured collapsed beneath the roar of indignant outrage. Some donors clapped, but not in reverence, in mockery, the sound sharp and cruel, echoing like jeers in a stadium. Others hissed for security again, their faces blotched red with offense. "This is absurd," one snarled, jabbing a jeweled finger toward Daniel. "We didn't pay for a mechanic's fairy tale." Another muttered about wasted time, about dignity, about the gala dissolving into spectacle. The very walls seemed to tremble with the force of money defending itself. Evelyn remained still, her spine straight, her lips pressed together, her gaze fixed not on the chaos but on the man across from her. And the girl pressed against his side. It would have been so easy to end it. She could raise her hand, summon the guards, dismiss it all as a stunt, reclaim her night with one swift motion. Her reputation would stay intact. The headlines tomorrow would praise her composure. Her donors would breathe relief. It was the safe choice, the expected one. But her hand didn't rise. Daniel bent slightly toward Grace, his hand settling steady on her small shoulder. His voice was quiet, meant only for her. "We're done," he whispered. He started to stand, the weight of the room pressing down, his body already leaning toward retreat. He was ready to take his daughter and slip back into the shadows, let the world sneer and forget him. It was a survival instinct honed by years of being unseen. And then Evelyn spoke. "Sit." One word, clear, sharp, final. It cut through the chaos like a blade. The jeers faltered, the clapping stopped, and even the orchestra musicians, still clutching their instruments like shields, froze. Daniel paused mid-step. His hand tightened on Grace's shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he studied the woman at the head of the table. Evelyn turned her gaze slowly, deliberately, across the sea of faces surrounding her. Board members with tight mouths, donors clutching their pearls, friends who weren't truly friends, who flocked to her light but scattered at the first flicker of shadow. Their expressions screamed expectation. "Fix this. Restore order. Protect us. Protect yourself." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a thread of something none of them had heard from her before. "Maybe," she said, letting the pause linger long enough for unease to swell. "We've been sitting at the wrong tables all along." The words were small, almost conversational, but they landed like an earthquake. The ground seemed to shift beneath the marble floor, a tremor that cracked through chandeliers and clutched throats. A board member blinked in disbelief, as though he hadn't heard her correctly. A woman gasped softly, covering her mouth with gloved fingers. Murmurs rippled, not as jeers now, but as confusion, uncertainty. Daniel lowered himself back into the chair slowly, eyes never leaving hers. Grace clutched her sketchbook tighter, her face half buried against his arm, but her eyes peeked out, wide and glowing. She had seen it too, the shift. For Evelyn, It was more than words. It was the taste of a truth she had buried under years of polish. She felt the mask she had worn for decades slip further, felt the eyes of her empire weigh heavy, waiting to see if she would shatter. She let the silence breathe, her own weapon now turned against her, not to dominate, but to reveal. The donors had erupted as enemies, their money tied to comfort, to tradition, to their seats at the oak. But something in Evelyn's tone, in the simple audacity of her words, had turned the balance. She could feel it in the air, fragile but undeniable. Not everyone in the room wanted to drag Daniel out anymore. Some leaned forward, curious despite themselves, pulled by a gravity they couldn't name. Allies and enemies. The line between them had never been thinner, never been so blurred. Evelyn sat taller, her heart tight in her chest but her face serene. She had chosen. She wasn't sure yet what the cost would be, but she knew one thing. Tonight, for the first time in years, she was no longer performing for applause. She was listening, and maybe, just maybe, so was everyone else. The hall still hummed with whispers long after Evelyn slipped out. The chandeliers behind her glittered like nothing had changed. The orchestra had returned to its safe crescendos, but the air was fractured. She moved with practiced grace through the corridor, her heels striking marble. But there was something unsettled in her stride. The donors would talk for weeks. Some would call her reckless, others would call her bold. But she couldn't stay in that room another second without confronting the man who had somehow rearranged the furniture of her life with nothing but words. She found him near a service door, standing alone with his jacket draped over one arm. The oil stains on his shirt looked almost deliberate now, a uniform of defiance against everything her world was built on. Grace was nowhere in sight. She had been escorted by one of the younger staffers back toward the quieter end of the hall. Daniel stood still, as if waiting, as if he'd known she would come. "Do you realize what you've done?" Evelyn's voice was low, sharp at the edges, but not the blade she meant it to be. Daniel turned, his expression steady. "Embarrassed you?" he asked. Then his gaze shifted slightly, calm and piercing. "Or reminded you?" The question landed harder than she wanted to admit. Her instinct was to glare, to summon that cold steel she wore in boardrooms, the mask that had never cracked even when she was being torn apart in headlines. But something about him, his unflinching stillness, the quiet certainty in his tone, eroded her armor. Her glare softened before she could stop it. "You make everything sound poetic," she said, her voice quieter now. "Engines, wood, even rebellion." He shook his head. "It's not rebellion. It's remembering." The corridor fell into a hush, broken only by the muffled laughter of donors echoing from the ballroom beyond. Evelyn exhaled, the sound slipping out like a confession she hadn't intended to make. She leaned against the wall, pearls catching the muted light. "My father taught me winning meant never giving up your seat," she said slowly, almost tasting the words as they left her. But maybe he was wrong. For a moment she didn't look at him. She looked at the floor, at her reflection, dimly warped in the polished stone, at her own hands perfectly manicured, but trembling ever so slightly. When she finally raised her eyes, Daniel was watching her, not with judgment, not with awe, but with the kind of clarity she couldn't remember the last time she'd seen in another person. He studied her like she was not a figure in headlines, not the heiress with a fortune and a reputation to protect, but simply a woman who had spoken something vulnerable into the air and didn't know how to take it back. And for the first time in longer than she could measure, Evelyn Harrington did not feel like a billionaire. She did not feel untouchable or unbreakable. She felt like a woman standing in a corridor with a man who reminded her that seats at tables, no matter how polished, did not make you whole. Her breath caught in her chest as the silence stretched between them. She realized then what unsettled her most. It wasn't that he had sat at her table. It wasn't even that he had claimed it. It was that sitting there he had made her question whether she had ever truly belonged at it herself. The phone rang just after dawn. when the city was still shaking the sleep from its bones, and Daniel was pouring cereal into a chipped bowl for Grace. He almost didn't answer. Calls that early usually meant overdue bills or broken engines waiting in alleys. But the voice on the other end was smooth, practiced. Evelyn Harrington's assistant. "Mr. Cross," she said briskly, though there was a hesitation under her polish. "Miss Harrington requests your presence. Today. Bring your daughter." Daniel frowned at the receiver, uncertain whether to laugh or hang up. The memory of last night was still raw, the gasps, the glares, the silence that had swallowed him whole. He had walked away ready never to set foot in that gilded hall again. But then he looked at Grace, who was doodling tiny stars in the margin of her math homework, humming to herself. Her world didn't need more doors slammed shut. Maybe it needed to see what happened when one cracked open. They arrived mid-morning. No gala lights, no donors in silk, no chandeliers shimmering down Judgment. Just a quiet boardroom with sunlight streaming through tall windows, dust catching caw in the golden beams. Evelyn sat at the far end of a modest table, not the oak one, but something plain, functional, without pretense. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, no jewels flashing, no photographers waiting. Before her lay a slim folder. Daniel hesitated in the doorway. Grace slipped her hand into his, steadying him without realizing it. Evelyn looked up. For a moment neither moved. Then she gestured to the chairs opposite. "This is the deed," she said, her voice level, but softer than it had been the night before. She slid the folder across the table with careful fingers. "The table is yours." "Legally." Daniel blinked. The words didn't land at first. He looked down at the papers, heavy with signatures and seals, and then back at her. "Why?" Evelyn's gaze faltered for the briefest second. The steel that usually held her eyes wavered, revealing something far more fragile beneath. She pressed her lips together, then let out a breath that sounded almost like surrender. "Because it never belonged to me," she said. Her hand rested lightly on the folder, as though reluctant to let it go. "And because maybe I'd like to sit at it again one day, without pretending I deserve it more than anyone else." The room seemed to shift in that moment, its air less rigid, its walls less sharp. Daniel stared at her, searching for the trap, the angle, the part where empire and ego reclaimed control, but there was none. Just a woman stripped of polish, offering something she could no longer carry without guilt. Grace leaned forward, her braid sliding over her shoulder, and smiled. It wasn't the wide grin of a child unburdened, but something gentler, wiser, born of nights watching her father fight against exhaustion, and mornings remembering her mother's promise. She smiled at Evelyn as though she'd just drawn her into one of her sketches, reshaping her into something softer, something real. And for the first time in her carefully choreographed life, Evelyn felt seen. Bosom seen, not as untouchable, not as a figurehead, but as a woman who wanted to belong without needing to conquer. The deed sat between them like a bridge, the ink not just a transfer of ownership, but a rewriting of what it meant to hold something sacred. Daniel didn't reach for it right away. He looked at Evelyn, then at Grace, then back at the folder. Slowly, deliberately, he placed his hand over it, not as a claim, as an acceptance. In that quiet boardroom with no chandeliers and no audience, something passed between them that had nothing to do with oak or wealth or signatures. It was the beginning of belonging, fragile and uncertain, but alive. The weeks after the gala unfolded with an unfamiliar rhythm. Daniel returned to his workshop, the one that smelled of oil and old timber, expecting life to slip back into its usual shape. Long days bent over engines, evenings helping Grace with homework, nights too quiet for comfort. But the silence was different now. It wasn't empty. It carried the echo of a woman's voice saying, "Maybe we've been sitting at the wrong tables all along." At first he thought it had ended there. A deed signed, a table returned, a strange chapter closed. But then she came, not with cameras or assistants trailing behind, not with her armor of diamonds and silk. Evelyn arrived quietly, the door creaking open as though even it wasn't sure it should let her in. Her shoes clicked against the concrete, out of place among the grease stains and sawdust. Daniel glanced up from the hood of a rusted sedan, rag in hand. "You're far from your marble floors." She didn't answer immediately, just studied the tools scattered across the bench like puzzle pieces. Finally, she asked, "What does this one do?" Her hand hovered over a socket wrench, tentative, as though it might bite. Daniel chuckled under his breath. "Depends if you're holding it the right way." From then on, she came often. Sometimes she stayed only a few minutes, asking about the difference between bolts and screws, or about the way oak carried sound differently from pine. Other times she lingered longer, leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, watching Grace sketch in the corner with a focus that seemed to draw the whole world into a piece of paper. Evelyn never interrupted her, never tried to correct or direct. She just watched, as though every stroke of the pencil carried a truth she'd never dared to name. The more she came, the less the workshop felt like Daniel's alone. He caught her one afternoon brushing dust off an old stool before sitting, her navy blouse creased from where she'd folded herself down without hesitation. Another day she reached for a wrench and held it so clumsily that Grace burst into giggles, her laughter spilling through the workshop like sunlight through cracks. Evelyn smiled, really smiled, unguarded, uncalculated. Daniel had to look away before she caught the surprise in his face. "You don't belong in heels here," he teased, wiping his hands on a rag. She lifted her chin, a smirk tugging at her lips. "And yet, here I am." The words should have sounded sharp, but they didn't. They carried a softness she rarely allowed herself. Grace returned to her sketching, pencil dancing quickly across the page, capturing Evelyn with a wrench in her hand and laughter on her mouth. When she showed it to them, Evelyn pressed her fingers to the paper as though it might burn. "I don't remember the last time someone drew me like this," she whispered. "Like what?" Daniel asked. "Like I'm not performing," she admitted, eyes still fixed on the sketch. Something shifted in the workshop that day. Something quieter than an announcement, but louder than denial. Evelyn began to kneel, literally at times, crouching beside Grace to study her sketches, leaning low over an engine to watch Daniel explain how pistons breathed. But more than that, she began to kneel in spirit. She listened. She asked. She admitted when she didn't know. And for a woman who had spent her life controlling rooms with silence, learning how to enter one as a student instead of a sovereign, was its own kind of revolution, Daniel noticed. He watched her trade certainty for curiosity, steel for softness. He caught her one evening running her hand along a strip of oak, not polished, just raw and waiting. Her fingers lingered there, and in her eyes he saw something crack, regret maybe, or longing. For the first time, he wondered if her wealth had cost her more than it had bought. The workshop became a bridge, not marble, not oak, not steel, but something made of laughter, questions, and the sound of pencils scratching truth into paper. And for Evelyn Harrington, who had built a life of walls, stepping onto that bridge felt like learning how to walk again. Of course, the world noticed. It always did when someone like Evelyn Harrington stepped even an inch outside the boundaries she had drawn in marble. Photographs surfaced within hours, grainy shots of her stepping into Daniel's workshop, a smear of oil across her blouse, Grace perched on a stool beside her, sketchbook in hand. The headlines didn't ask for context, they shouted, "Billionaire heiress seen with mechanic and daughter." From gala to garage, Harrington's fall from grace. Charity queen or commoner pretender. The tabloids dressed it in scandal, while the business journals framed it as betrayal. Donors withdrew quietly at first, their polite emails lined with regret and vague excuses. Then the calls came, voices sharper. Promises of pledged millions evaporated into air. Board members stormed into meetings with clenched jaws and spreadsheets, waving numbers like weapons. "Our reputation," one hissed, "isn't built on sentiment. It's built on strength." Evelyn listened, arms folded, face composed, though inside she could feel the tremor spreading through the empire her father had left her. Greg Stanton, her PR strategist, was the loudest voice of all. He leaned across the boardroom table, his suit crisp enough to cut. "You're risking everything," he said, his tone carrying the certainty of a man who had always believed image mattered more than truth. "The donors are panicking. The press is circling. You've got photographs of yourself smiling in a mechanic's garage, for God's sake. If you don't distance yourself, you will lose control." Evelyn didn't respond right away. Her gaze drifted to the corner of the boardroom, where Grace sat curled over her sketchbook, drawing with the kind of absorption only children and artists could manage. Her hair fell loose around her face, her pencil moving in strokes quick and sure. Evelyn caught a glimpse of the page, 3 figures around a table, not in gowns or suits, just sitting together. Then her eyes shifted to Daniel. He sat at the far end of the table, not fidgeting, not rattled by the storm of numbers and threats. His face was calm, his hands steady on the wood, like a man who had lived through worse collapses and learned that not everything worth keeping could be shaken loose. His very presence seemed to remind her of the truth she had begun to touch in that workshop. Engines teach patience, oak teaches memory, and silence isn't always control. It's sometimes surrender. Evelyn felt the board's eyes pressing on her, demanding she act like the woman she had always been, the one who protected the empire first, who polished the surface until it gleamed so brightly no one asked what was underneath. But then she looked again at Grace, at Daniel, and at the sketch in the girl's lap, and she realized the empire she had built had never made her feel like she belonged. Not the way this did. She rose from her chair. The room fell into stillness, the kind that always came when Evelyn Harrington stood to speak. She placed both hands on the table, steady, unshaken. "Then let it fall," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried like stone rolling down a mountain. "I'd rather lose an empire than miss what I've just found." The words cracked through the boardroom like thunder, impossible to take back. Greg Stanton opened his mouth, but no sound came. The board members shifted uneasily, some outraged, some startled, all of them stunned. Daniel met her eyes across the table. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded, as though acknowledging a truth spoken aloud at last. Grace looked up from her drawing, her wide eyes shining, and for the first time Evelyn didn't feel like a CEO defending her legacy. She felt like a woman reclaiming her life. The empire trembled, but Evelyn did not. The workshop smelled of oak dust and oil, a strange marriage of Daniel's 2 worlds. The winter had given way to spring, and with it came light streaming through the high windows, catching the swirls of dust in golden ribbons. Daniel stood bent over a wide oak slab, sleeves rolled past his elbows, his hands moving with the kind of patience he had learned from years of fixing engines and remembering his father's lessons. Each stroke of the sandpaper smoothed the surface, not into perfection, but into something alive. Grace sat nearby on a low stool, a paintbrush gripped in her small hand, tongue caught between her teeth as she painted flowers along the edges of the slab. Tiny bursts of color bloomed against the pale wood, wildflowers, uneven but radiant. Every so often she'd glance at her father, searching for approval, and Daniel would nod, a soft smile tugging at his lips before he returned to sanding. Evelyn was the least comfortable in the space, though she came often now. Her heels had been traded for flat shoes, her designer dresses replaced by plain slacks and a blouse, hair pulled back in a simple tie. She stood with her hand resting on the unfinished wood, her manicured nails brushing against the grain. "What is this for?" she asked, though her voice carried curiosity rather than doubt. Daniel straightened, dust clinging to his forearms. He smiled faintly. "A table." She smirked, arching a brow. "Obviously." He shook his head, eyes softening. "No, a real one. For us. For family. For whoever needs a seat." The words settled over her like a warmth she wasn't ready for. Evelyn had sat at 1,000 tables, long, polished, heavy with crystal and silver. She had spoken across them, conquered from them, commanded silence at them. But this table was different. It wasn't being built to impress. It wasn't being carved for power. It was being born from sawdust, laughter, and the simple belief that a table wasn't worth anything if it didn't have room for everyone. They worked late into the night, Daniel sanding until his shoulders ached, Grace adding vines to her flowers, giggling when the paint smudged across her fingers. Evelyn trying, awkwardly at first, to help with the smaller tasks, holding clamps in place, sweeping dust into piles, brushing off stray shavings. She didn't belong in workshops, she knew that. But here she wasn't Evelyn Harrington, the heiress, the untouchable face of an empire. She was just Evelyn, with dust in her hair and tiredness in her bones, learning what it felt like to make something not for profit, but for memory. At one point, Grace held up her paint-streaked hands and laughed. Daniel grabbed a rag to wipe them clean, but Evelyn stopped him. She knelt, taking Grace's hands gently into her own, wiping each finger with a care that surprised even herself. Grace looked up at her, eyes wide and trusting, and Evelyn felt something inside her crack, the realization that this child saw her not as a billionaire or a headline, but simply as someone worth letting close. The hours stretched. The slab began to look less like raw wood and more like a table. It wasn't perfect. The edges were uneven. The paint smudged in places, the surface still rough in spots. But when they finally set down their tools and sat around it, Daniel with sawdust still clinging to his arms, Evelyn with streaks of dust across her blouse, Grace with paint dried on her fingertips, it didn't matter. They spread sketches and rags across the surface. Grace laid her head on her folded arms, smiling sleepily. Daniel leaned back, exhaling with the satisfaction of a man who had built something with more than his hands. Evelyn traced a finger over the flowers, her throat tight in a way she couldn't quite name. It wasn't polished yet, but it was honest. And as they sat together in that workshop, beneath the hum of silence that felt more like belonging than absence, they knew this table would carry more history, more love, and more truth than the grand oak at the gala ever had. The table was heavier than Daniel had expected, though not in the way of oak alone. When he and two of his co-workers lifted it off the truck, the weight felt like something else too: memory, promise, hope. Grace skipped ahead of them into the house, directing with all the authority of an architect, calling out where it should go. "By the window," she insisted, "so the flowers can catch the light." Evelyn followed more quietly, holding a stack of mismatched plates she had borrowed from Daniel's neighbor, her hair loose, her sleeves rolled. She looked nothing like the woman who once graced the cover of financial magazines. She looked, Daniel thought, more real than she ever had. By the afternoon, the table stood in the center of the small home, the legs steady against the creaking floorboards. Neighbors wandered in with bowls of pasta, baskets of bread, pitchers of lemonade. Kids from Grace's school darted between the adults, giggling, dragging chairs too large for them toward the table. Workers from the garage arrived still smelling faintly of gasoline, their palms rough and honest. And even, surprisingly, a couple of Evelyn's old acquaintances, faces familiar from the gala, had come, curiosity outweighing pride. They looked out of place in linen jackets and silk scarves, but they accepted paper plates when Grace offered them, and the room softened around them. The food was simple. Bread torn by hand, stew ladled into bowls, apples sliced into uneven wedges. But laughter filled the air richer than any orchestra ever had. People leaned across the table, passing plates, trading stories, spilling crumbs on the wood Daniel and Evelyn and Grace had shaped together. Children pressed their painted palms along the edge, leaving smudges that Evelyn did not wipe away. She watched it all unfold with a stillness that surprised her. She had dined beneath chandeliers, listened to violins swell for her entrance, raised glasses with men who held nations in their pockets. Yet none of it had felt like this, messy, unpolished, loud in places, tender in others. And as she sat there, shoulder-brushing Daniel's, watching Grace chatter about her sketches and her school projects, Evelyn realized she didn't feel the absence of marble floors or silver cutlery. She didn't feel lesser without the shimmer of her empire surrounding her. She felt whole. Daniel leaned toward her, his voice quiet under the hum of conversation. His hand reached across the table, rough and certain, and closed over hers. She startled slightly at the warmth of it, then let her fingers lace with his. He gave the smallest squeeze. "Told you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something he'd known all along. Belonging isn't owned, it's shared. Her throat tightened. A tear slipped free before she could stop it, streaking down her cheek. For once she didn't rush to hide it. She let it fall, let it breathe in the open air of a home that wasn't hers by deed or contract, but by invitation. Grace laughed from across the table, her eyes shining, her hands sketching even as she talked, and Evelyn felt the truth land fully in her chest. She hadn't lost her empire. She hadn't surrendered her place in the world. She had found something she didn't know she had been searching for. A table that welcomed rather than excluded. A family that didn't measure her worth by power, but by presence. A home, not in marble towers or boardrooms, but in the warmth of sawdust, paint smudges, and shared bread. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Harrington didn't feel like she was fighting to prove her place. She didn't feel like she was holding on to something that could be taken from her. She felt simply and profoundly like she belonged, and in that belonging, she discovered the one thing her empire had never given her: peace. If this story touched you, take a moment to share where you're reading from in the comments. I'd love to know. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss the next story of courage, love, and second chances. Until then, stay kind, stay brave, and keep building the tables that bring people together.